But yeah, maybe we can start though. And Julia and Munip, people will join where as they come in. I think a few more will be coming in as the time goes on. But just to quickly introduce, we have our guests today from Conservation Optimism team, which are based with Oxford University. Please, Julia, you'll probably do a better presentation of it. But I know that you guys have been working many years linked with Oxford University and grown a lot in the next few years and created this team to promote optimism in conservation and messaging and in communication, and even developed a toolkit to do this. So we're really happy that you could come here and share with us some of your wider conservation experiences. So not just thinking about snow leopards, but conservation throughout the world and different approaches to conservation. And Munip is here as well, who is part of the snow leopard community. So it's nice to bridge those snow leopard community and conservation optimism groups. So please go ahead and start the session. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'll just share my screen, and Munib will kickstart us with the intro. Let me just share my screen now.
While Julia is sharing the screen, can somebody tell me if I'm audible okay, or is my voice a bit cracky? Then I might not speak through the microphone. Is it good?
Mm-hmm. Good.
Oh, great, awesome. Yeah, no, thanks so much for to everyone for being here today, and it's lovely to be back. So many familiar faces. As Sibylle was saying, it's lovely to have these webinars, just a way to connect to everyone, and yeah, hopefully. We'll have a fun and engaging session today. Julia and I, as you know, Justine said, we're representing Conservation Optimism here today, and talking a little bit about crafting messages using a solution lens. And that's what really Conservation Optimism is all about. It's a movement where, we believe in optimistic, positive storytelling, because we believe, even though the world might be ravaged with many different issues within those negative things that are going on in the world. There are positive stories of change, positive change that once highlighted and learned from can really help people and nature with that. And we'll briefly speak about this positive communication toolkit that's there. So with that, Julia, will you go to the next slide, please? Just to start off by telling everyone a bit of the outline of the session. So I'll do a very quick intro for the next 10 minutes or so. Then we'll dive into this toolkit that I spoke about, which sort of helps us, as you can see with the subpoints, with things like framing, talking about why we're communicating, values, beliefs, communication traps. And then we might have a bit of a sort of a break for questions regarding the positive communication toolkit. Then we'll go and speak a little bit about creative communications, after which we'll have a break, and hopefully the second part will be a little more interactive and sort of get everyone to think about things like, who you would like to reach with your work and the best formats in doing so through a group activity. And then we'll do a debrief and wrap up towards the end. So just a sense of how this will play out. But before we start this session, next slide, yeah, thanks, Julia. We thought it would be nice to sort of think about this question, and Julia will pop a link into the chat, which will allow us to answer this question. The question is, do you feel optimistic about the conservation in your context, about conservation in your context? So think about, the conservation context you're most familiar with. Do you feel optimistic about it? And I think the link that Julia sent us, if you click it, it will take you to a Mentimeter poll and allow you to answer with a yes, no, and a maybe. And then also, I think there's a second question linked to that. We'd like to hear from you. What is your biggest challenge when it comes to communicating about environmental issues? So if you could scribble a few things there, that would be great. So I'll just give you some time. And I think you can see, as you can see from Julia's screen, the answers pouring in. And thank you, everyone. I see a lot of people have introduced themselves in the chat. So it's great to have people from all over the place. So yeah, welcome and thanks. So yeah, as we can see, the answers pouring in. Most people are optimistic sometimes. So good to see that there is some semblance of optimistic, some not so much. And one answer saying yes. Great, we'll just give it a minute to come in. Oh yeah, and then we can see some interesting answers coming in about what are some of the biggest challenges when we're communicating about environmental issues. We have points like convincing people to care. Yes, those can be really hard, right? Like, especially when we care about something so strongly and then we don't necessarily see other people reciprocating, then we want to get that message across and it's not the easiest sometimes. Motivating for engagement is linked to that. Environmental fatigue, okay, that's an interesting one. And then there can be many sources of environmental fatigue. Helping people change, community mobilization, that's quite an important one. Get people's interest. So lots of different ones, and some of them interlinked and some of them quite independent. So clearly, there are a lot of different challenges. I see that the answers are sort of tapering. So maybe with that, we'll maybe stop the Mentimeter and share the screen back, Julia. Great. Thank you so much. So yeah, no, that's great to know, and thanks everyone for answering that. And with that, I just wanted to quickly introduce ourselves before we dive in. I'm Munib. I'm part of Conservation Optimism. I'll let Julia introduce herself first, because I think that way I can just sort of continue on from there. So Julia, do you want to just quickly talk a bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm Julia, and I'm the Director of Conservation Optimism. I've been working for Conservation Optimism for the past few years now. And as part of my job, I do a lot of outreach, science communication. So that's been my background for the past few years. I have a mixed background. I studied both applied ecology and conservation and then journalism. So I'm kind of like combining it in my job with having the expertise in the communication side, but also the scientific knowledge. So yes, I also have, so you can see at the bottom the logos. So Inkline is a media platform that I co-founded a few years ago, and it's all about solutions journalism and really looking at stories of people trying to make a difference in the world and not just focusing on the doom and gloom and what's not working. So that's me. And then yes, as I mentioned as well, the logos that you see at the bottom are our supporters and funders. So we are part of the Interdisciplinary Center for Conservation Science Lab at the University of Oxford. And we're also supported by the Weekly Fund for Nature and Synchronistia. And I'll pass it back to Munib.
Great, thanks, Julia. And really to sort of a disclosure to everyone, like Julia is really the driving force behind conservation optimism. And I just feel lucky to be here because I represent a smaller faction of conservation optimism. And as you can see on the screen, I'm the India Hub coordinator. So this movement that Julia spoke about, that's sort of based out of University of Oxford and its founding partners, we hope to sort of, spread our wings across the world, and by developing regional hubs. Me being from India, I was very keen to take it to my country. So that's sort of the role I play there. And my background is very much in sort of natural sciences within ecology and conservation. I'm doing a PhD currently, but very, very interested in communicating science to a wider audience. That's how I got, linked to conservation optimism in general and find myself here today. So that's a bit about me. Yeah, next slide, please. So yeah, let's dive in directly. And again, disclaimer number 2 is that, as you probably heard from my description, I do not have a background in communication or storytelling or things like that, but quite an interest in it, especially because, as we saw from the Mentimeter answers, sometimes it's very hard to communicate the importance and urgency of things to a larger audience. And that's where I thought to myself, okay, what are some of the important things that I can learn as an individual, for instance, to communicate messages better? And there's a lot of resources out there, but there's one specific one that many people in conservation optimism have helped develop that I feel is a very, very useful sort of guideline and a very practical guideline to messaging and communication. It's the positive communication toolkit. It's also visually very appealing for me personally, anyways. And we'll talk a little bit about the toolkit today. And towards the end, we can share a link to the toolkit on our website. So, in your free time, you can sort of dwell into it a bit later. Essentially, the toolkit is a guide to framing or reframing conservation messages to empower action. And with that, next slide, please. To start off, really, and I apologize, there might be a little too much text on the slide, but we'll run through it. To start off, really, the toolkit talks about framing. And when we think about messages, in whatever format they may be, the frame of the message is quite important. And the toolkit asks us to think about what is framing and why that is important. As stated on this slide, frames are relative bits of information stored in memory that are mental structures. These mental structures can be engaged by a single word, by a phrase, or an image. For different people, there can be different words or phrases that mean certain things. Images might conjure up certain messages or frames, as long as it carries a clear set of association and implies a way of viewing the world. As I said, these could be words, images, characters, actions, emotions, and importantly, values, which we'll speak about in a bit. Essentially, when we think about framing of messages, we have to kind of acknowledge that what's already in people's head matters. So there's an example on the left that I'll just speak about, and then also speak about a more personal example from back home. So on the left, on the extreme left of this slide, we have a not so happy koala, as you can see. And the message below says something like, due to the devastating bushfires that have already destroyed much of Australia's nature reserves, koalas are now considered functionally extinct. So this sort of framing and this messaging sort of doesn't paint a very optimistic outlook for the koalas. It almost makes you feel like they might not recover from this framing, from this bushfire, for instance. And while that may be true to some extent, there's more nuance to the reality. And I think the framing on the right side perhaps provides that nuance. Koalas have been hard hit by the Australian bushfires, and these conservationists are working to come up with a plan for how to help save them. So it shows that, yes, the gravity of the situation is something worth considering, but there is something worth fighting for. A quick example from back home, and many of us might be familiar with this. We have leopards we have snow leopards, of course, high up in the mountains, but we also have common leopards in the lower areas of the Himalayan mountains. I'm from the northern part of India, and a lot of times common leopards would come into negative interactions with people, and could also lead them to killing people. So there were these news bulletins from my hometown where we would have things like, oh, man-eating leopards, across the town, and this would really conjure up images of fear, even anger within people. They would read these reports or go out thinking, these leopards are out to kill people. And then suddenly over time, we had a lot of people, especially, responsible journalists, talking to a large number of community members and talking about how even these common leopards are sort of victim of negative human-wildlife interactions. So they're not out there sort of hoping to kill people whenever they see them, because of habitat loss or other infrastructural issues. They're coming into close contact with people, many of which is negative human-wildlife interactions, which can lead to death of people. And it just slightly changed the way people were viewing the issue, from being this villainous actor, the leopard, that was going around like a bloodthirsty killer. People realized the leopard is also a victim of its reality, and people wanted to then start working towards mitigating these negative wildlife interactions rather than just having this negative connotation. So framing really matters in these contexts, and important to ask ourselves what the framing is of our messages. Next slide, Julia. And I think what helps really, and this is illustrated in the toolkit, is asking yourself, why are you communicating, right? And there's a rule of 3 that I think quite helps us, and maybe some of us have heard of this before in other contexts. Asking yourself, okay, what is the objective of my communication? What is the audience? Who am I communicating this to? And what is the outcome that I intend from this communication? These three questions, if we try and answer before we communicate, might help us tailor our messages. Next slide, Julia. And yeah, and as I was saying a couple of slides previously, framing and what kind of messages we send out will be strongly influenced by the values and beliefs of people. And I think this is quite tricky because different people might have different values and different beliefs. But I think what's important to acknowledge is that every message will engage values and belief to some extent, right? No matter what those values and beliefs are. And beliefs and values are important as they help determine how your message resonates with people and in turn how well it motivates them. So for instance, to give you a concrete example, like perhaps I would believe that the belief of, oh, everything is doomed and nothing's gonna change, perhaps is not helpful in inspiring action. But the belief linked to this belief that's saying, oh, okay, things are not too good in the world, the biodiversity crisis is real, things are not too good, but if we come together, we can find solutions. That belief is linked to the first belief that I spoke about, but it sort of inspires more action. So there are some helpful and not so helpful values and beliefs that one can sort of engage with. Some of the interesting and perhaps helpful values and beliefs that we can engage with at a universal level that might be helpful are listed on the left. For instance, things like equality, equal opportunity for all, perhaps is a valuable, sort of a more positive belief to engage with. Values such as, unity with nature, self-respect, social justice, these are certain values that are useful. So again, I know this might sound a bit tough to sort of pinpoint, but asking ourselves, what are some of the values and beliefs that are useful to engage with? Next slide, Julia. And as you can see, Julia has put in the chat, and as you can see on the slide here, we can take a moment right now to think about, what are some of the values that you usually use in your messaging, with your, if you're at an NGO, maybe with your funders or your supporters or whoever really. And would you like to switch to other values instead? So I'll just give you a couple of moments to type in the chat. And oh yeah, there's some lovely answers already. So Julia says, yeah, we at Conservation Optimism often use things like love, creativity, and unity with nature. Nadia says, working for the welfare of others. Yeah, that's a very good one. Nadia, would you like to expand on what you mean by welfare of others? Feel free to do so in the chat or just by unmuting yourself. Harshad says compassion. Yeah, that's a very good one, very important one. I think that's one of the more important ones because, yeah, a world without compassion perhaps would not be be something that we want to be in. Inclusivity, representation is definitely a good value to connect to. Connections, Justine says, that's also very, very important. Nilofer says sense of belonging to nature. Yeah, absolutely. Not having this dichotomy of nature and people. Sometimes I know, and it might be different in different contexts, so I acknowledge that. But yeah, back home as well, I think sometimes this dichotomy of people and nature being two different things is not very helpful. Oh, I hear someone's unmuted their mic. Did you want to say something?
Oh, hi, this
Yes.
is Nadia.
Yes,
and
Nadia,
I thought I'd just quickly say what I meant to say here is because I mostly works with these local people. So because like while we work with this conservation organization, I often felt like we are helping to these people to having a better life. And so in that context, I just wrote this working for welfare for others.
Awesome. Absolutely. That's such a kind perspective to have, Nadia. So thanks for sharing with us. Some more pouring in. I'll just read a couple of more and then I can hand over to Julia to sort of talk us through the next part of the presentation. So Chemi says, mindfulness and inclusion. Absolutely, Chemi. Those are two important ones. Sibile says, but also tapping into innate human selfishness in the developed world, especially. Nature can sustain and help us, de-stress, nurture us. Absolutely, Sibile. And we've seen this perhaps more during the pandemic than ever, right? Like it's those, I mean, certainly for me, currently I'm in Oxford. I love to be up in the mountains in India, but you know, the nature parks around me have really been such a help, you know, just for my mental health and just also physical health. So it's a great place to, as you said, you know, de-stress and nurture us really. Yeah, psychological health, absolutely, absolutely. Great, awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for all the really interesting points in the chat. And with that, Julia, over to you for the next section.
Thank you, Munib. And yes, it's really interesting, this the case for nature having become more important during the pandemic, I feel, because particularly for people who were in cities, because everyone was kind of like trapped. And we've definitely felt that with our community as well. We asked students from Oxford, you know, how did nature help you during lockdown? And we received so many beautiful testimonials with people started foraging, they started doing wild swimming, they kind of like started just reconnecting with nature in a way that was different to what they might have done before. So that's definitely one that we've picked up on as well. So just to keep going with the toolkit, I'm now going to tell you a bit more about some of the common communication traps. And so Munib will put in the chat as well the link to the full toolkit, so that after the presentation you can have a look and download it, because we're just giving you a snapshot here, but there's more in the actual toolkit. So communication traps and how to avoid them. So the nice thing with these traps is that they link to an animal. So they're like, the animal is made to make it more memorable and helps you remember, okay, this animal is linked to this specific trap. And what we like as well is that it makes it very visual. And one thing to remember is that the traps are not mutually exclusive. So they can be kind of like combined together. And this is something that we worked on with a consultant called Ralph Underhill from Framing Matters. And so he is the person who worked with us and helped us develop this toolkit. And we did so through a workshop with our Conservation Now members. So if you've not heard of the network before, we have a network of about 120 organizations that have pledged to be optimistic with their messaging. The membership is completely free, so any organization can join. There's just a section on the website where people can sign up for their organization to become a member. And what we did is we brought different members together in a workshop, and we asked them, you know, what are the common traps that you feel you sometimes fall into or that you pick up in the media. And so all the examples that you can see, or most of them throughout the toolkit, are real life examples that our members kind of like told us about. So that toolkit was really developed in collaboration, which was a really fun process. And so the first trap I wanted to tell you about here today is the parrot trap. And so as you know, a parrot is often known to repeat things. So this is the repetition trap. What this trap is we don't want to just repeat back what someone else said. And for example, you don't want to say the Green Revolution will not mean that people lose their jobs, because even though you're negating it, what you're doing is then putting this idea back in people's mind. That might be something they did not think about before. And now, even though you said they won't, you kind of start thinking, oh, well, is there a risk they will? Like, why is that on the table? So that really introduces the idea that job might be lost, when actually what you want to focus on is the idea that sustainable development is good for jobs. So here you can see the reframing of this specific trap, for example, would be the Green Revolution will create jobs. And then what you put in people's minds straight from the beginning is a positive idea, rather than negating the negative idea. So the action that we suggest here for this specific trap is that you make a parrot list for the office, or, you know, for yourself. You can stick it on the wall if you have like virtual teams, like a lot of us do at the moment. You can pin it on Slack or whatever you're using with your team. And you can highlight the parrot traps that you've seen. So, you know, if you've read a newspaper or like a media article or a press release from a conservation organization, and you've noticed that they kind of been using these you know, negating ideas, you can just like put it on the list, and then you remember next time you use it. And that's one that we find is quite helpful. We also have the shark. So the shark is the contaminated and contested language trap. So I'm sure a lot of you might have heard of the movie Jaws and how that kind of like impacted so much on what people think about shark and this idea that they're terrifying creatures who will just eat you. I mean, obviously, there was already a lot of fear around sharks before that happened, but that really reinforced it. And so that's the idea that you want to avoid playing into negative associations. And sometimes it's things that we don't necessarily think about as conservationists because it's such a part of our jargon, of our vocabulary that, you know, we use these words all the time, not necessarily thinking that someone not in conservation might not take them exactly the right way. And yes, so the human-wildlife conflict we thought is partially relevant to snow leopard conservation indeed. So rather than saying human-wildlife conflict, you might want to say interactions between people and wildlife, because there's also positive interactions that can happen. And I feel very often we kind of like resort to human-wildlife conflict as the default, whereas interactions between people and wildlife kind of keep it open. You could talk about conflict, but you could also talk about coexistence. So that's one that we find quite useful. But if you look at the toolkit, there are more examples as well in there of these type of terms that we tend to use. And again, here, the action is very much to make a list of contaminated terms. You know, what are the ones that you realize you're using? And when you're using a contested framing, you know, you really want to question whether you can win the fight for it or if you should just change the word. And so again, very often when you think about it, you realize that there's a slightly different way of saying it that might be more neutral, like interactions instead of human-wildlife conflict. This third trap is the Cobra, and that's the threat-heavy trap. And so that's something that we really care about at Conservation Optimism. That's something that we really try to do as much as possible. It's very much you want to balance threats with positives and action. So one thing that we often see when people hear about us and Conservation Optimism is this idea that they kind of think we're kind of like blindly optimistic. They think that we're saying everything's fine and nobody needs to do anything and the planet will kind of get better by itself. And that's not at all what our ethos is about. What Conservation Optimism says instead is that we think it's really important to highlight the challenges. We need to let people know about what's happening and what are the issues. But we think that leaving it at that is just making people feel powerless and kind of like you end up with people who just end up turning off, like, you know, they just don't want to hear it anymore. I think we had environmental fatigue mentioned earlier as a challenge. I think that's a big one. I feel like even for myself, you know, when I was a journalism student, I kind of got tired because I had to read the news all the time. And it was the year of the Brexit referendum and the Trump election. It was an intense year to be reading the news. And I felt at some point, I reached the point where I was like, I can't take this anymore. Like, I just decided not to read the news anymore. And I feel sometimes people feel that way with the environment. If it's just all doom and gloom, you reach the point where people are like, well, clearly there's nothing we can do. We're too late. So what we're suggesting is rather than just ending on the problem, we talk about the problem and the challenges, but then we bring in potential solutions. And so by bringing in potential solutions, then you give people that hope of like, okay, someone is trying to do something. There is possibility I can make a change. And so that's something as well that you can see in failures. You know, I think talking about failures is also really important. But if you're talking about a failure, then can you say what you can learn from it and like what's the takeaway? And I think if you can, then that's very powerful. So here the example for this specific trap, if we look at specific sentence rather than like big issues, is one of our members who work with penguins said, instead of saying chinstrap penguin populations are plummeting due to climate change, you could instead try, while the charismatic and much loved chinstraps are declining rapidly with climate change, the largest colony has survived the 2016 volcanic eruption, showing their ability to adapt if we help them to do so. And so again, it's just taking that step back, looking at the bigger picture and trying to think, are there any kind of like bright spot? Are there other examples that we can use to highlight potential solutions? And the action here is to make a list of file of conservation successes you can draw on. The great thing is if you follow us on Twitter or on social media, if you follow Conservation Optimism, you will get regular conservation success stories coming your way. Every Monday, we publish a blog of 7 optimistic stories of the week. So that's also a good way to get regular ones. we're also working on developing a database of positive conservation stories. So hopefully that will be really helpful for everyone who kind of need to build these this list and file of conservation success stories. Then we have the vampire bat, and so that's the tide casting trap. That's the idea that you don't want to use character roles without questioning them. And I personally found this one really quite striking. Like I remember when the consultant mentioned it, I was like, this is so interesting. And that's something that I think we often use without really thinking about. And I think being a bit more mindful is, again, like a very powerful way to kind of shift the narratives that we are creating in conservation. And you might recognize this as well. That might apply to some cases with what you see with snow leopards. So the example here is for bloody skull, all that's left of rhino poacher trampled by elephants, then eaten by lions at Kruger National Park in South Africa. I don't know if you remember seeing that headline, but that happened, I think, about a year or two ago. A poacher got killed by various animals. And the comments and the headlines were just horrific. You know, it was like the writers just forgot that that person was an actual human being who had a family, who had, you know, like who might have had a reason to be poaching. You know, maybe it was a question of like it had lost his livelihood or her livelihood. Like, you know, there's so many issues that are pushing people to potentially become poachers. And I feel very often in conservation we sometimes have this simplified narrative of the poacher is evil and they're the bad people, and so, you know, it's like in this headline, like they deserve to be killed by animals, which is just horrible. And I think as well, like it makes us focus on sometimes like just a tiny part of the story without really looking again at the broader picture. If we look at this specific case, if it's about rhino poaching, so rhino or ivory, by putting the focus always on like the poaching and what the local communities might be doing, we're kind of forgetting that what's creating the demand is in completely different countries, and that, you know, the problem might be actually people who are buying the ivory and then are fueling the demand. So the action for this one is to try to steer clear of villains and victims, unless you have a clear purpose in mind that suits the role. And I think just questioning this kind of character that sometimes we use without really thinking is really important. So again, always trying to take that step back and looking at the bigger picture is quite important. So what we are going to do now is we are going to take any questions you have on the toolkit, then we'll go to the other part, which will be about Creative Commons. But Munib, if you want to put maybe your camera back and we can take a few questions if you have any. I'm just looking as well through the chat. I can see that a few things were posted. Yeah, I can see the comment about the Brazilian government. Yes, so would you want Munib to tell us a bit more about what your comments about herders?
I mean, I just thought personally, like I think the traps just help us understand some of the not so good issues with the way we communicate. Like like back in snow leopard landscape, definitely back home in the high Himalayas in India, you know, there are these negative human wildlife interactions that happen. You know, people live very close to snow leopards. Snow leopards sometimes will end up killing people's livestock, and in retaliation, you know, the herders might retaliate and harm the snow leopard or even kill it in certain times. But I think it's important to think about it from the typecasting trap sense, because not necessarily, like almost always, from my understanding anyways, like the herders are not there to kill snow leopards just because they want to. They're actually protecting their livestock. And unfortunately, sometimes that ends up in a circumstance where they do kill the snow leopard, because, you know, the herders are there to protect their livestock. They're there to protect their family, you know, feed their children and so on and so forth. So I think, you know, it's very easy to be like, oh, look at those bloodthirsty herders. They've killed all the snow leopards. You know, they should be put behind bars, for instance. You know, if the country's laws are like that, which India's laws are like that, for instance. But yeah, just trying to think about the nuances, I think, is helpful, and hopefully these traps help us tailor those messages that way.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I can see as well that someone mentioned that it's hard not to think of the people who are driving demand and at the apex of illegal wildlife trade as villains. How do we do that? For me personally, I feel like that's kind of coming from my journalism background, but I would say it's all about telling people stories, you know, even so, be it if they're poachers or be it if they're the one actually consuming the products at the other end. I think it's important to understand like what's driving motivation and kind of like presenting as an individual person with its, you know, his own life, and then kind of like creating a story around it rather than presenting them as like consumers are this homogeneous group that just, you know, use or eat specific types of wildlife and they're all the same. I think sometimes it does help to have, and obviously in a media piece, the way we would do that is by then bringing in quotes from consumers potentially. So, you know, just asking them questions and then bringing that in. I feel bringing in the people's perspective is important, and I feel sometimes it's a rule that we forget in conservation. Like when you're in journalism school, that's one thing that is drilled into you. You know, people want to read about people, and so sometimes in conservation, when we tend to focus on the animal in the narrative, then it's not necessarily as powerful as if you bring some human perspectives in there. Obviously, it depends on, you know, what you're working on, but that would be my advice for this specific question. Did you have anything you wanted to add to this one, Muni?
I don't see the question. Can you repeat the question quickly?
So it was about how do we not portray the people who are driving demand of illegal wildlife as villains?
Yeah, no, I think I'll just echo what you said. I mean, by making a more generic point that, yeah, you hit the nail on the head when I think treating entities as homogeneous is not helpful. Like, you know, we use the word community a lot, for instance, you know, back in snow leopard landscapes, maybe not from the perspective of consumers of wildlife trade, but like from the local community perspective, you know, when we're negotiating certain conservation interventions with them. Almost never will any quote unquote group of people be homogeneous. You know, you have people having different inputs and thoughts. So I think we have to be very careful to ensure we understand, you know, the diversity of thoughts and represent those, you know, when we're communicating. You know, not all community members will be for, you know, a certain interventions, and not all will be against that. So being aware of heterogeneity and trying to represent that is useful.
Yeah, I think someone, Justinia asked, do you think the term poachers shouldn't be used anymore? So I think there's still value in using specific words for describing certain things. So I wouldn't necessarily say, you know, we shouldn't use the word poachers anymore. But I think we do need to bring a bit more details when we're talking about poachers, because it's such a generic term. And I feel like at one end of the spectrum, you've got highly militarized, you know, groups in some part of the world that are doing the poaching. And then in the other end of the spectrum, you have some community members who, you know, might be one person doing it with like very limited resource just to try to, you know, put food on the table for their families. And so I feel like maybe we just need to be a bit more careful with like putting more description when we're talking about poaching, you know, what is it that we mean? Because I think very often what jumps in people's head is straight away like the kind of like big poaching operation that we see with like ivory or rhino horn, for example. Like that's the examples that I know best. But yeah, Muni, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think I again have a more generic thought. Like, if we're not sure about intentionality, then using certain words might be not the right way to go about it. For instance, like from the little I know of, you know, a bit of the trade in snow leopard landscapes, sometimes it's not necessarily a directed trade where people go out to, let's say, maybe kill a snow leopard to then sell it. It might happen as a byproduct of a negative interaction. So then, is that person a poacher or not? I mean, I don't know the technicalities of these words. So in that case, I would probably steer away from using certain terms because they might have certain implications. So, you know, if we're sort of in a gray area, maybe better to, use caution in using certain terms, unless we're very sure. We're like, okay, we understand the reality on the ground. We understand the reality of these words. Then we could use it. Basically, point being, using something without really thinking about its real world implication and on-ground reality if you find it's a gray area, best off not to use certain terms than others is what I would say.
Yeah. Do you want to take the next question? Because so far I've been answering them first.
I was going to say, I would love to take the next question. So that's a very pertinent question by Harshad. So I think it says, in communicating, how might we navigate between conservation optimism and conservation realism, which are sometimes at opposite ends of the spectrum? But as communicators, surely it is also our responsibility to present an undiluted truth. Looking forward to your thoughts. So Harshad, again, like I'm not, as I said, I don't have a conservation background, but from my understanding, I think I don't necessarily see things, conservation optimism and conservation realism as two different things. The reason why I say that is, I think Julia mentioned it a couple of slides previously, like at conservation optimism, the whole ethos is to not steer away from the truth. You know, it would be quite, it wouldn't be ethical and also not right to minimize, an issue. Like a conservation optimistic message is one that acknowledges all the issues of and all the negatives of an issue, but then sees if something can be done about it. It's an action-oriented stance. So I think conservation realism is really a subset of conservation optimism, and when you add an action-oriented step there, I think that's what makes it important. And now, for the certain instances where there might be nothing that one can do, I think that's where I would say one can also take the perspective of sort of learning from things that are not necessarily quote unquote successful. And I think that's very useful as well. And that still, I think I would qualify that as conservation optimism, for instance. So I hope that sort of helps a little bit. But yeah, Julia, I don't know if you wanted to add more.
Yeah, I think you've given like the answer that I was about to give. So you've covered lots of different points that I would have brought up. I think the only other thing that I would bring in is just, for us, it's a lot about, again, looking at that bigger picture and looking at the nuances. So we have in the lab we're part of at the University of Oxford, we have lots of people working on wildlife trade issues. And that's always a very interesting one to frame when it comes to like conservation optimism, because I'm sure as lots of in wildlife trade, it's sometimes hard to find like the optimism or finding the kind of light or like the brighter side, because it can be it can just be quite overwhelming. And one thing that we've done last year is we've created like a big infographic tailored for young people. But what we wanted to do, looking at the wildlife threat specifically, was showing why you can't just say, let's stop all wildlife trade and then everything will be sorted. So what we've been doing is just showing how it happens in so many different countries, but also showing that some wildlife trade is positive, because obviously illegal wildlife trade is not. But what in terms of wildlife trade overall, there's so many different species. And if you think of timber, if you think of like lots of different crops, like if you think of plants, so what the way we covered that topic to bring in the optimism was really to take that step back and looking at, okay, here is the world, here are all the different continents, and for each continent we took 2 examples of wildlife trade, one that was quite well known, like rhino horn, let's say, and then another that was more niche and that people might not have heard of. Like I remember there was this species of insect that you only found in some caves in Europe, and that are being collected. And so that way we felt, and for each story as well, we kind of brought it like a little fact about why we're optimistic about it. So we felt that was working quite well. And even in cases where things might look quite, not necessarily bright, like rhinos again, we still had examples of like, here is what someone is doing, some organizations are doing, and the rhino numbers in that place are actually increasing, or looking at other specific smaller examples. So I think that can be a way as well to do it. Oh, I can see it. There was a question about how do you respect and craft dialogue with people who are driven by greed only? That's something that I would actually tap into my journalism knowledge for. I can share it during the break. There is this great checklist from an organization called Solutions Journalism Network, and they have crafted this checklist for journalists to be better at covering polarizing issues. And so it kind of have like questions to really make you feel think like another person might on the opposite end of the spectrum. So for example, they created that during I think they were looking at specifically like politics, you know, when you have like a Trump supporter and someone who can't understand how that person can be a Trump supporter, they were kind of like trying to build that bridge to bring more diverse narrative in the media. And I think that's one that we can use in lots of different cases when there is polarizing issues. So I'll put that in the chat later. I don't know if you had anything to add to that one, Munib.
I think I'll probably learn more from that myself. Yeah, no, nothing really. Thanks.
I think that might be it for the questions. I can see, I think there was a comment, but I think it was a comment and not a question. So I guess we'll just get back to the Creative Comms part of the presentation, if that's okay. But thank you for all the questions. So now I just wanted to give you a bit of a snapshot of creative communication and what are the different ways that you can play around with your communication to reach different audiences. And so just wanted to start by giving you a little bit more background about conservation optimism and how we started. So we initially started as a one-off conference in 2017, and it was meant to be a conference mixing academics, practitioners, but also artists. There was this idea that we wanted it to be very like vibrant and just tap into different communities to make our message, you know, reach different audiences. And so that happened in 2017. And what happened after is that people just liked the idea so much that it just grew organically and became, you know, more of a program and then more of an organization almost. And so once we transitioned to becoming not just a one-off event, we started thinking about the different things that we could do in that conservation optimism space. And people just kept using our hashtag on Twitter to share success stories or positive stories. And so what we did is we started thinking of different ways that we could reach different audiences, because as Munib said at the beginning, knowing who your audience is an important part of that process when you're thinking of messaging. And so one aspect of that is we decided to continue working with artists. So you can see here, one of the photos is an artist called Louis Masai, and he was at the very first summit in 2017 and did a massive mural at the London Zoo as part of the event. And so from there, we kind of like started thinking, how can we integrate more artists? Because we feel like that's a really good way to reach people that might not otherwise engage with your message. You know, if you have like a mural at a big zoo, people passing by or going to the zoo might be people who don't necessarily look at conservation messages, but because it's there, then you engage that bigger audience. And so the way we've been doing that is we started doing a film festival in 2019, and I will tell you a bit more about the film festival in a bit. But we decided to, again, have artists come during the screening, and we had a drink reception beforehand. We did that at the Museum of Natural History in Oxford. And so we had like an artist doing live painting on the day around the theme of conservation optimism. We had artists exhibiting their work and having a chat with our audience. And then last year, when COVID hit, we had to very quickly turn our film festival into a digital film festival. And so what we decided to do is we put a call out on our social media channels saying, hey, we're going to do a virtual art exhibition. If you're an illustrator or a photographer and you want to be featured, just let us know, send us your illustrations, and we'll put it all in a page that people can see on the day. And so that's what you can see on the screen here. We had Rachel Hudson, who does really cool illustrations. But we also had lots of like PhD students sending us photos about their fieldwork. We had various illustrators. So it was really fun to allow these artists to like have a bit of a platform and, you know, curate a collection of different artists as well. And we had like lots of page views on the day. So I think people really enjoyed having that art side. And again, that's a way to just reach a different audience. And then it's a good way to cross-pollinate as well, because once you build this relationship with artists, you never know what might come out of it. And, you know, sometimes we now have projects where we need specific illustrators and we just know them already because we've kind of given them that platform before. We also decided to start a podcast. So again, when we were thinking of our communication, most of it was like via blogs or via social media. And we wanted to reach a different audience and maybe a younger audience. And we thought that podcasting would be a great way to do that. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about crafting what a podcast would look like. And we had decided that it would be about like 25 to 35 minutes max, because we felt that was the best timing for podcasts at the time. A lot of it was due to like, that's what the estimated commuting time was. So there was a lot of research behind 25 to 35 minutes. But I think that's all gone by the windows now that people are kind of like not commuting as much at the moment. So I'm seeing more and more longer podcasts. But so what we do through the podcast is we interview a range of conservationists, and we want to show that everyone can be a conservationist. You don't have to be trained as a conservationist. So for example, we talk to a psychologist who is specialized in eco-anxiety and climate grief. We talked to someone who is creating an app to help conservation. We talked with a theater producer who is creating plays around conservation themes. So again, that's a great way for us to amplify voices of lots of different people, and also bring conservation into through a different format that we hadn't explored before. And so we have found that the podcast has been really successful, and we've reached I think it's over 32 countries. So again, it's a way to reach people very globally as well, quite an international medium. We also do a lot of things around stop motion animation. So Sophia, who is our creative communication manager, she knows how to create stop motion animation. So she kind of like trained a few people in the team, and we found that this worked really well with kids. So again, a completely different audience that we were trying to reach, and we thought, well, actually, kids need something to do, particularly like younger kids. So what we've done in the past is we brought lots of Legos, and the good thing with Legos is that they often have animals and like people and different things in the set. We put the Legos out, and the kids just straight away like flew onto us and started playing with the Lego, and we created like a stop motion platform. So there's an app that you can use, and then we just use like a tablet or a phone, and they would create a scene and then take a photo, just move it a little bit, take a photo, and by the end they had like an animated films. So that's again like another creative way that you can also engage different groups. So as I mentioned before, we started our film festival in 2019. We're now on our 3rd edition. So if you know any filmmakers, they can submit their short films. They have to be under 5 minutes. They have until end of May to do that. So it's still open for submission. And that's been fantastic. Again, as you can see, we've really reached like quite a global set of like filmmakers. And we've seen fantastic films on lots of different topics in lots of different languages. And so that's always really fun to then put that into a screening. And what we've done last year is we've screened it on YouTube as a YouTube premiere. So we had about 900 people viewing the film festival so far. And we're going to do it again, because we realize that then it really builds up on that audience that we might not reach otherwise. So we will have probably a few screenings in the UK, and potentially in Oxford, Glasgow, and London. And then we will also have it online so that people can watch it. And again, because we have different categories, and we're looking for like student films, animation, it's a great way to give people a voice and have them share their stories, while at the same time also reaching quite a global audience. So we feel that works quite well for us. So I'm just going to take maybe a few questions on this specific part before giving you all a little break before we move to the next phase. So let me just check in the chat to see if there's any questions that have appeared.
I can catch up quickly on the chat, Julia. I don't think there were any questions as such, but there were points about how I think SLN themselves are starting a podcast in different languages. That's very exciting.
Yeah, that's something that we're looking into. It's an interesting.
Oh, not SLN. Sorry, Justine was saying. Let us speak. Sorry.
Yeah, but it's an interesting one, isn't it? Like Munib and I have been talking about how to start podcasting in different languages, and like, do you then do it? Do you have the interview in one language and then the transcript is in English? Like it's something that we're currently looking at how we can integrate that, because again, we're very keen on not just featuring English speakers, because sometimes that's obviously a limit to who you can then have as a guest, because people need to be, especially on a podcast, you need to have people who are comfortable enough talking and speaking in English. So I think that's going to be like our next big thing. Can you tell me a bit more, Justine, about the interviews you're mentioning?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't want to take up your time, so don't worry. I was curious because we were thinking of, so I was working with Nadia, who's here also in the audience, on a Mongolian podcast related to community conservation and the partners' principles, and we also with other Rain Country members. But we were thinking, how does one make podcasts engaging, without that visual aspect we do with videos? So we were discussing, for example, including interviews with two people. But don't worry, don't feel you need to answer that.
No, that's fine. I mean, one thing that I can quickly say about that is there's so many different formats within the podcasting community. Like there's so many different options. So nowadays you've got people who are doing like narrative podcasts. So then it's kind of like one person telling a story, and then sometimes they include bits of interviews. I've listened to one about puffins recently that was really fun, and it was kind of like a mix of one person talking, and then they had bits of interviews, scientists working with puffins. It was quite fun. But what we found worked quite well for us is the format that we've decided on is Sophia and I have a bit of an intro and a discussion about the guest, about the topic. Then we go into like a 20 minutes max interview with someone. And then at the end, we kind of debrief and again have a conversation about how that kind of the topics that they touched on link to our own personal lives, so that we still bring that personal view that I think people find quite engaging in a way. Like it's just like these tiny anecdotes I think people are enjoying, so that it's not just facts or like just science. We try to mix it up a bit. So that would be my my tip.